This is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in psychology, neuropsychology concentration. I wanted to read an article from Research in Organizational Behavior. The article is called Best Practices How to Evaluate Psychological Science for Use by Organizations. Um, this article was published in 2011, volume 31, page 253 through 275. It's written by Susan T. Fisk, Eugene Higgins, professor, and Eugene Borgida, professor of psychology and law, Morse alumni, distinguished professor of psychology. Abstract. We discuss how organizations can evaluate the psychological science for its potential usefulness for their own purposes. Common sense is often the default but inadequate alternative, and benchmarking supplies only collective hunches instead of validated principles. External validity is an empirical process of identifying moderator variables, not a simple yes/no judgment about whether lab results replicate in the field. Hence, convincing criteria must specify what constitutes high-quality empirical evidence for organizational use. First, we illustrate some theories and science that have potential use. We then describe generally accepted criteria for scientific quality and consensus, starting with peer review for quality and scientific agreement in forms ranging from surveys of experts to meta-analyses to National Research Council consensus reports. Linkages of basic science to organizations entail communicating expert scientific consensus, motivating managerial interests, and translating broad principles to specific contexts. We close with parting advice to both sides of the researcher-practitioner divide. In caricature, an earnest, lab-coated scientist with an electronic tablet accessing hundreds of studies sits across the table from a designer-suited manager, sneaking peeks at a smartphone accessing scores of corporate communications. The behavioral scientist fantasizes that mere scientific expertise suffices to make the case that the latest, exciting, reliable basic research should inspire the organization's practices. The manager prefers to anticipate the competition's latest plans. What are the proper origins for organizational innovation? Neither the one in the white coat nor the one in power suit is making the best use of the other's goals and knowledge. This essay aims to help them talk to each other more. This essay aims to help them talk to each other more effectively and to begin to build bridges that span these two different and complex perspectives. Evidence-based management is gaining ground, but perhaps not fast enough. Here we explore why. Using data to discern best practices in legal or management decisions is not easy. Potentially relevant evidence is too abundant, hard to evaluate, possibly confounded, maybe not applicable, perhaps biased by conflict of interest, often self-selected, and harder to assimilate than a good story. Pfeiffer and Sutton, 2006. Of all these pitfalls, this article suggests ways to manage the first two issues: overwhelming quantity and ambiguous standards, which together constitute one take on the criterion problem, how to understand the consensus of experts, to cut through the sheer quantity, and how to assess quality science, to focus on the best. What we mean by criterion is not an objective standard, because none exists, but rather how to judge credible expert consensus about high-quality science. To foreshadow, we advocate for reliance on peer review to judge quality and on independently vetted summaries of the current science to assess consensus. We write as basic behavioral scientists with some experience of organizations, besides working in them, and as consultants in the fraught domain of employment discrimination. We have most deeply considered the use of psychological science in a courtroom. Barriga and Fisk, 2008, Fisk and Barriga, 2008, in Press. But here, we seek to address a set of issues with broader applicability. We are hardly the first to grapple with these issues. Research to practice tensions are perennial in organizational psychology. For example, these debates have arisen in whether to design business schools as focused on emics, immersed relevance, or ethics, scientific rigor, Walsh et al. 2007. Especially boisterous debates have surfaced recently in the research in organizational behavior regarding the implicit association test, specifically Jost et al. 2009, Tetlock and Mitchell 2009. In many of these debates, a pair of parallel concerns are the disrespect of practice, hence the inattention of the manager in our opening example, or its mirror image, the neglect of the scientific and especially laboratory-based evidence in management, hence the earnest demeanor of the scientist. The research and practitioner communities have long mistrusted each other. Vinker and Copes, 2011. We do not pretend to resolve these tensions here. Of course, the research practice synergy ultimately benefits both. Zendek, 2011. And collaboration between them has long been recognized as ideal. Argyris and Chung, 1996. For example, the origin practical theorist Kurt Lewin noted that people buy into new practices best when they help develop them. Lewin and Gravel, 1945. Here we focused on one specific facet of basic research being used by organizations, namely the criterion problem, how to decide when evidence should trump common sense. We presume that, if available, sound scientific evidence should trump common sense. But we also recognize that political and financial considerations, and even professional biases, for example, skepticism about social and behavioral science that resides in some quarters, often play a role in situations where scientific evidence challenges everyday understanding. Common sense as an alternative. Absent evidence, common sense is the default. It's convenient, believable, inexpensive, and most of all, comfortable. But organizations should not use mere familiarity as a criterion. Adopting organizational innovations on the basis of intuition and common sense can be costly in dollar terms, especially if and when subsequent evidence suggests that such innovations are ineffective and a waste of money. See Klonowski, Bell, and Dodson, 2010. Common sense is neither as commonly held nor as sensible as people think. The false consensus phenomenon alone shows that people's individual hunches do not overlap with other people's as much as they believe. Ross, Green, and House, 1977. And common sense is famous for being contradictory, as any opening lecture in the introductory social psychology shows, quoting conflictual aphorisms. Opposites attract, the birds of a feather. Nevertheless, people persevere with familiar beliefs, resisting their overthrow. For example, Bastardi, Ullman, and Ross, 2011, on biased evaluation of scientific evidence. Fisk and Taylor, 2008, on schemas. Another caution against common sense is casuistry, namely the phony logic that anyone can muster to support desired outcomes. Norton, Bandello, and Darley, 2004. People choose to evaluate more favorably evidence that supports their preferred outcomes. Bastardi et al. 2011, Kunda, 1987, and people interpret as biased a third party who represents the objective middle ground between their view and opposing view. Malone, Ross, and Lepper, 1985. Worse still, people believe they are immune to these biases. Cronin, Gilovich, and Ross. Cronin, Gilovich, and Ross 2004. As an example of the weight of common sense, a content analysis of 2000 through 2008 federal race and sex discrimination cases, King, Dunleavy, Jafer, Morgan, Elder, and Gribner, 2011, shows reports of both subtle and overt forms of hostile behavior. But only the most overtly intentional negative workplace behaviors that fit common sense ideas about discrimination actually increase the likelihood of pro-plaintiff legal outcomes. More subtle insults and denigrating comments about women and ethnic minorities had to occur more frequently and pervasively to meet common sense standards for race or sex discrimination. Yet science shows that underrepresented group members routinely pick up and are undermined by the subtle microaggressions. Sue Capodilupo, Torino, Bossieri, Holder, Nadal, and Esquilin, 2007. Judicial behavior may not be behaviorally realistic in light of contemporary science. The law may not be aligned with scientific consensus regarding the subtle nature of discrimination. King et al., 2011, page 56. So, too, with management, at least sometimes. We raise common sense as the alternative to empirical evidence, not to disrespect practice, but to paint a worst-case scenario for the consequences of neglecting high-quality scientific consensus. Management by instinct, we suspect, is a frequent decision rule in many quarters, as attested by Jack Welch's Straight from the Gut, 2001. However, hunches and intuitions are unlikely to use the most up-to-date scientific insights. Human decision makers, managers included, are ruled by individual heuristics and biases, as just noted. Collective hunches are not necessarily more valid than individual hunches. Organizations may use benchmarks adopting a practice from a successful organization just because that overall organization works well. Popular management techniques do increase the CEO's compensation, but they do not predict corporate performance. Stahl and Epstein, 2000. Absent direct evidence, the role model organization success could be due to entirely other factors. Hence, even collective daily experiences does not prove validity, which is an empirical question. Generalizability, external validity. Common sense often prevails in arguments, specifically about applications of basic science to organizations. External validity is the key issue here. Case in point, social psychology experiments are in principle applicable to organizational settings. College sophomores are young adults too, but the criticism often arises that laboratory studies must exaggerate effects because the rarefied environment can isolate the phenomena of interest in a silent, hygienic, frictionless, and weird vacuum. Henrik Hein, Nerizayam, 2010A, 2010B, Sears, 1986. Surely, the noisy, dirty, windy, real world will demolish the delicate effects obtainable in rarefied laboratory settings. But this is not necessarily so. Locke, 1986. For example, real-world in-group, out-group effects are often stronger than laboratory effects. When meta-analysis compare the two, people will favor their in-group even more in the real world than in the artificial, minimal groups of the laboratory. Mullen, Brown, and Smith, 1992. People judge the out-group as more homogeneous than the in-group, and even more in the real world than the lab. Ostrom and Sadkids, 1992. People preferentially remember stereotypic information about an out-group, more so outside the lab than inside. Stanger and Macmillan, 1992. People prefer familiar others more in the messy real world than in lab studies. Bornstein, 1989. Some of those I actually forgot. Contrary, or consciously at least, contrary to the physics laboratory, people are not particles. Their behavior is often overdetermined by several correlated forces acting together in real world settings. External validity settings may show stronger effects precisely because of being confounded. Of course, field settings may sometimes show weaker effects than laboratory settings. As meta-analyses often examine, see upcoming section on establishing consensus with meta-analyses. Relative strength of field effects as is an empirical question appropriate to what might be considered the third stage of understanding a phenomenon. First, basic research demonstrates an effect. Then, second stage documents process explores boundary conditions, moderators, that produce stronger and weaker effects. The issue is not so much lab versus field as a variety of identifiable conditions that interact with the phenomena of interest. Locke, 1986. Older models of external validity assumed that effects simply would or would not generalize because of differences in participants, measures, and context. But more modern approaches treat generalizability as a conceptual and empirical stage of research. Indeed, the stages represent a cycle that can recommence with field conditions that inform basic research. For example, Fisk's theory and research program on power as control contributing to stereotyping, 1993, started with the realization that the then extant research then extant research spoke more to peers judging peers than to managers judging subordinates. One feature of the setting in her testimony for Prince Waterhouse versus Hopkins, 1989. But even without the power dynamics, basic processes of social cognition proved useful in understanding the organizational dynamics at work in the decision to deny partnership. The field setting informs the lab settings and vice versa. In fact, Cialdini, 1980, long ago, advocated for a similar approach to external validity concerns and called it full cycle social psychology. In this approach, Cialdini, 1980, page 44, emphasis added. Initial natural observation gives direct to subsequent controlled experimentation, the outcomes of which can then be given external validity or validation through further natural observation that may stimulate still further experimentation. Systematic recourse to the evidence of the real world, both before and after performance of the experimental work, may thereby reduce the extent to which current social psychological research can be criticized as artificial and epiphenomenal. Overall, organizations seek the evidence about implementing new policies and innovations or the efficacy of extant policies and innovations should give no priority to the idea that lab effects will not generalize. Indeed, what organizations should consider, assuming the quality and consensus criteria elaborated next is that the principles, not the exact operationalizations, will generalize. Benangi and Crowder, 1989. Cf. Brief and Dukerich, 1991. That is, intuitions to the contrary, ecologically valid field methods do not guarantee generalizability of findings. Instead, ecologically valid methods are orthogonal to the generalizability of the results. That works in one narrowly defined but real setting might not work in another. But from such real-world research, one cannot know the mechanisms to account for any differences in results. What matters is the systematic control over spurious relationships. So, for example, both laboratory experiments and correlational studies, lab and field, have linked group cohesion and performance. Controlled experiments show that cohesion can improve performance. So now that principle is ready for export. What this particular field literature adds, besides testing generalizability, is longitudinal data showing that performance can also make groups more cohesive. Mullen and Cooper, 1994. Longitudinal is long-term research and data, not just a snapshot. Both results get us beyond common sense, which might equally argue that cohesive groups become isolated and self-satisfied, which would be contrary to what it's reporting. Instead of undermining performance or undermining performance in the process. Common sense can argue any result and its opposite. That's, I guess, a takeaway. Common sense can argue any result and its opposite. Although group cohesion has, and that's probably the reason why we have the scientific method in science, although group cohesion has costs and benefits, the meta-analysis show benefits, and more important here, feedback between performance and cohesion. This illustrates the back and forth between lab and field as both generating and testing hypotheses. Lived experience or participant observation often generates theory, which is then fine-tuned in the lab and brought back to the field for a cycle. Cialdini, 1980. But as Stahl, 2010 suggests, this full cycle approach to research is difficult to achieve, and caution must be exercised in applying experimental findings directly to workplace settings. Cases in point include the external validity concerns that constrain the integration of laboratory-based judgment and decision-making research, the JDM tradition, into organizational studies. We really don't know whether many of the most accepted biases and heuristics will stand up to the array of forces facing actors in natural settings such as work organizations. Stahl, 2010, page 413. For a successful full-cycle approach to these external validity issues, Stahl suggests that JDM researchers need to be more ambidextrous in their methodological toolkit and choice of research settings, and they need to collaborate more often with organizational researchers whose work is grounded in organizational studies. What theories and science get used? Before evaluating the criteria for using behavioral science evidence, it is important to specify what theories, what science, and what uses are involved in such an evaluation. Some illustrative issues provide the flavor of the problem before the main event. What theories? Usefulness is a common criterion for judging applicable organizational theories. Example, Miner, 1984. Usefulness refers to how much the theory guides effective action toward a goal. Not just any theory can apply in practice. Jarvis, 1974. Useful theories must be coherent in two ways. First, internal consistency avoids the relevant variables being incompatible in practice, in that maximizing one would prevent the other. For example, increasing accountability may decrease privacy and individual sense of control, which may or may not be priorities. Or self-government may increase buy-in but create destabilizing tension. Certainly not productive unless the cost is worthwhile. Second, coherent theories as used must also be congruent with the original theory as espoused. A leader may believe in democratic leadership, but behave autocratically without self-awareness sufficient to mind the gap. Once coherent, the proof of a theory in practice depends on demonstrating its effectiveness. The relevant outcomes need to be facilitated, of course, but also other valued outcomes need to remain at acceptable levels. To judge such effectiveness, the theory in practice must be testable. Specifying the antecedents, mechanisms, and consequences allows disconfirmation. testing may create a cultural clash, as uh, Argyris, 1974, notes. In effective practice, one must be committed, confident, and decisive. But in testing a theory, one must take a tentative, skeptical, and experimental stance. Otherwise, the self-stealing, the self, the self-sealing theories fall prey to expectancy effects, impervious to testing. Argyris, Argyris prescribes affirmation without dogmatism. Even if theories in use fit all these criteria, being internally consistent, congruent, testable, and effective, the final criterion is whether the world they create is valuable, unintended consequences and all. Unintended consequences and all. This is an empirical question of a more grounded sort than basic science, but empirical nonetheless. The debate over the intended and unintended consequences of goal setting mentioned earlier illustrates the comprehensiveness process of assessing organizational value on a variety of expected and potentially unanticipated dimensions. All too often, theories are not seen as the pragmatic basis on which organizational decisions and policies should be made. That is, they may seem abstract, idealized, irrelevant, while managers must cope on the ground, wrestling with the alligators in the mud. Theories may seem like the luxurious purview of academics with tenure job security and no practical accountability for their theories' effectiveness in the world. On the other hand, perhaps theories need not be evaluated for their organizational usefulness. Theory can be useful in a broader sense than whether it immediately informs organizational practice. Brief and Dukerich, 1991. If usefulness prescribes directly what an organization should do, a more general practical theory sensitizes one broadly to how an organization might see itself in new ways. Does a useful theory need to prescribe action, or can it supply concepts for framing the issues? Requiring a theory to prescribe a specific action in a specific situation may be a mistake because such a theory would not identify basic principles and because its prescriptions would be too specific to generalize. Furthermore, as philosophy of science notes, an aggregation of specific prescriptions do not accumulate to scientific progress unless they constitute part of a larger testable theory that will ultimately make way for a new theory. Moreover, the requirement for immediately useful prescriptions may narrow theoretical vision, constrain creativity, neglect mechanisms, and distract from basic science. Brief and Dukerich, 1991. An overly specific set of recommendations is not a theory precisely because it is too narrow to explain anything beyond the particular application. In contrast, a generally practical as opposed to immediately useful theory can shed new light on general organizational issues, having utility in a broader sense. A practical theory can focus on principles by elucidating general truths that reflect other truths, which in turn inform management as well as teaching and research. Locke, 2009. Most important, practical but abstract principles can inform evidence-based management. What psychological science? Assuming that general principles from basic behavioral and social sciences can be predictable for organizations, what kinds of science likely prove most relevant? Sampling recent handbooks in organizational science yields plenty of topical overlap with psychological science: decision-making, leadership, power, personality, learning, creativity, challenge, stress, performance, goals, incentives, justice, values, culture, roles, stigma, stereotyping, teams, and negotiation. Anderson, Ones, Senangel, and Vis Westveren, 2001, Locke, 2009, Zedek, 2011. As a specific example, the basic science of intergroup contact has settled on some principles that together predict successful conditions or for diversity that works: authority, support, equal status in the setting, common goals, and cooperation. Pettigrew and Trupp, 2006. What's more, as we now know, these principles operate not through increased knowledge, but through the effective conditions that reduce anxiety, increase empathy, and allow friendships. Pettigrew and Trupp, 2008. Trupp and Millett, 2011. Trupp and Pettigrew, 2005. These well-established principles offer practical insights for organizations building diverse workplace teams. See Plot 2010 on building a diversity science. As another example, laboratory research famously shows abundant flaws in ordinary decision-making. Fisk and Taylor, 2008, Gilovich and Griffin, 2010, Kahneman, 2007. Ever since the first foibles in human interference were documented, Nisbet and Ross, 1980, optimists have opined that the lab tests are unnatural, unfair, unrealistic, or unfamiliar, and besides, errors are either self-correcting or socially corrected, the argument goes. So, in this view, the research may underestimate people's everyday decision-making. Stahl, 2010. Nevertheless, as just one example, the track record in organizations prior to the Great Recession hardly inspires faith that somehow moving outside the lab makes decision makers hyper-rational or accurate. The economic model of the rational decision maker is not faring well even in its home discipline. Gilovich and Griffin, 2010. The vulnerabilities in human judgment offer both cautions, as noted, and cures in the form of using psychological science to make more mindful decisions. Weber and Johnson, 2009. As a completely different example, potentially relating to liability issues, the media and entertainment industry minimize any link between video violence and actual aggression. Anderson and Gentile, 2008, Bushman and Anderson, 2001. Yet the basic science repeatedly shows that violent video games increase aggressive behavior, thoughts, and emotions, as well as decreasing empathy and prosocial behavior. Anderson et al., 2010. Further, the important conceptual variables in this literature generalize between lab and field. Anderson and Bushman, 1997. The links to organizations are several. Given product liability, producers of violent media might conceivably end up responsible for heightened aggression, especially in children. Granted, the U.S. Supreme Court in June 2011 struck down a California law that prohibited the sale of or rental of violent video games to minors, declaring that these video games are protected speech under the First Amendment. Brown versus Entertainment Merchants, Assassin, 2011. Or perhaps organizations that permit on-site gaming, presumably during workday breaks, might inadvertently prime antisocial behavior. As a parallel, the presence of sexually objectifying media in the workplace primes sexual harassment of women, according to both basic science and judicial precedent. Rudman and Borgida, 1995. Robinson versus Jacksonville Shipyards, Inc. Thus, principles of aggressive or sexual priming and spillover from media to behavior can inform the evidence-based use of media in the workplace. As a final example, behavioral science can be practical in telling organizations what not to do. After a National Research Council report, Committee to Review the Scientific Evidence on the Polygraph, 2003, discredited lie detectors, the use of peripheral physiological responses to indicate deception should be suspect. Some agencies compiled, for example, Cumming 2007, Yet the practice, both by agencies of the federal government and by private corporations, continues precisely because public common sense believes them. So polygraphs extract confessions. Iacono, 2008, Iacono and Lycan, 2005. The neuroscience of deception likely will have a similar pattern, acting as an inaccurate but intimidating polygraph marketed by those who stand to profit thereby. Fisk and Borghitta, 2008. Physiological measurement is always less than a royal road to unbiased assessment, so its role should be limited to well-validated uses. Kang, Inslick, and Dirks, 2010. What uses? Assuming the practical theory and evidence, how do organizations use the science? Answer: apparent even from the outside, abundantly. Apart from the list of overlapping handbook chapter topics just noted, the domain itself is clear. If organizational psychology is the behavior of people at work, Zedek, 2011, then the domain itself includes just about every human behavior except a full night's sleep, though maybe even this applies to airline pilots and long-distance truckers. In practice, business-related demands often focus organizational uses on management, selection, performance, appraisal, teamwork, leadership, motivation, and job satisfaction. Nevertheless, the practical use of theory and evidence are constrained only by the imagination. What comes to mind for us are areas where we ourselves have a scientific foothold, but do not see organizations making sufficient use of our field. For example, the extensive use of psychological scientists as discrimination experts in litigation tends to focus on identifying and preventing bias due to gender, race, and age. Examples to date in our edited volume: Banks, Eberhardt and Ross, 2008; Crosby, Ovidio, 2008; Eagley and Koenig, 2008; Nelson, 2008; Fitzgerald and Collingsworth, 2008; Hillman, Haynes, 2008; Rudman, Glick, and Phelan, 2008. See also Nelson, 2009; Ovidio, Houston, Glick, and Esses, 2010. Why could the cited science not be used to promote the best of available not be used to promote the best use of available human capital? If we know what deciders tend to use, that deciders tend to use convenient categories and their attendant stereotypes, unless otherwise attentive and motivated, then why not best instead of the same old decisions? Critics, of course, ask whether these processes demonstrably exist in organizational contexts and whether proposed remedies have been tested. Focus the use of psychological science techniques on how to make in the organizational settings as well as in laboratory contexts. Mostly, reviews show the principles hold up well in both lab and field, but unquestionably, more empirical work grounded in work organizations would go a long way to addressing the critics' concerns. Taking this idea further, research useful outside most business organizations but applicable in the justice system may have lessons for issues in management. On the surface, eyewitness identification and testimony, false confessions, and invented memories would seem to have scant role outside the courtroom, but in fact, employees and managers have to report on their own and other behavior all the time. This science, conducted for another practical purpose, may be useful in organizations more generally than in litigation contexts. For reviews, see our edited volume, Kaysen, 2008, Loftus, Gary and Hain, 2008, Wells and Hassel, 2008. In fact, organizational psychology shows considerable research interest in the prediction and modeling of counterproductive work behaviors. Detecting employee deception and dishonesty matters to many organizations, given costs associated with destructive employee behavior. Another untapped domain familiar to us in psychological science describes the universal dimensions of social cognition. Because organizations consist of people, these principles are potentially useful. People making sense of other people rapidly decide if another individual or group has good or ill intentions, warmth, trustworthiness, and the ability to enact them or not, competence, uh, capability. For review of the stereotype content model, SCM, see Fisk, Cuddy, and Glick, 2007. These dimensions appear across dozens of cultures. Cuddy, Fisk et al. 2009, Durante et al. 2011, and account for 80 to 90% of the variance in impressions. Wojcicki, 2005, Predicting Emotions and Behavior, Cuddy, Fisk, and Glick, 2007. We know of two organizational applications. Just recently, thanks to serendipity, these SCM dimensions have been applied to corporate images in branding surveys. Kervian, Malone, and Fisk in press. For example, J&J is seen as admirable, well-intentioned, and competent, whereas BEP is seen as disgusting, untrustworthy, and incompetent. Google is enviable, respected but disliked. Amtrak is seen as pitiful, well-intentioned but incompetent. These four kinds of images predict purchase intentions and brand loyalty. Theory and evidence from basic research in another domain may prove useful in marketing. Images of other companies may also inform decisions about corporate allies and competitors. Another SCM application focuses on managing diversity within an organization. Fisk in press. Not all prejudices are alike, and not all are negative. For example, older and disabled people both are judged as warm but incompetent, whereas both Asians and female professionals are often judged as competent but cold. Poor people and immigrants are viewed as neither trustworthy nor competent. All of this has implications for monitoring biases in employment decisions for underrepresented groups. Another article in this value focuses on warmth and competence judgments in organizations more generally, Cuddy and Glick in press. Next part is an in-depth example, the motherhood penalty. I'll read that in the next video as I don't want to make the videos too long.